Welcome, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, welcome to the Trade for Sustainable Development Forum 2019. Mainstreaming sustainability, embedding it into the DNA of every business and every organization. My name is Claire Doul. I'm just here to make sure that things go on track and smoothly. And they do, because my first responsibility is to introduce the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, Arantxa Gonzalez, who will be making some opening remarks. Arantxa.
Thank you so much. Well, let me start by welcoming you all to this 6th edition of the Trade for Sustainable Development Forum. A special welcome to the Barbados delegation that have come from a bit far away, not a lot, a bit far away, to share their thoughts with us in that sustainability is not just an adjective that matters for the island, is what matters for Barbados. Dorian was a Category L hurricane. This is what the UN Secretary General said. Earth's most important ecosystem is on fire. This is what an environmentalist campaigner said about the fires in the Amazon. 1 in 5 people will be directly affected by the melting glaciers and the ice caps, and the people forced to move and radically change their way of life, about 1.4 billion people around the world. In high mountain regions, we know this because we live in an area that is going to be affected by that. In low coastal zones, this is what we will hear from the Prime Minister of Barbados in a minute. The Arctic, the small island states, this is what the Swiss journalist wrote recently when talking about the UN Climate Change Conference. I didn't want to begin this morning with all this gloom and doom, but I did want to start with a realistic note in that this is the world we live in today. We are not going to solve these issues here in this room this morning, but we certainly can contribute to making change by highlighting data, by highlighting facts, by sharing knowledge, by explaining and understanding how we do that, and by coordinating our action in that this needs to be the collective effort of all of us. There is no better way to humanize this picture than our very special guest, Prime Minister Mottley. When Prime Minister speaks, people listen. She speaks is the hashtag that we want to use this morning. Not just because she's got lots of interesting things to say, but also because she lives in a country that is at the forefront of a lot of the issues that we will be discussing in the next 3 days. 2 weeks ago, I was in New York for the UN General Assembly. I heard many things from young activists starting their life journey and from politicians that were nearing the end of their careers. And the tone was not optimistic. We can no longer hide our heads in the sand. Then, of course, this also matters for the trade community that in a way we represent in this city. We hear lots of noises about trade conflicts, about Brexit, about whether or not multilateralism is good or whether or not it matters. I think it does. But the reality is that on an issue like sustainability, like climate change, this is the core concern, making cooperation, making multilateralism, making this the norm to resolve the challenges posed by the transformation that our economies, that our societies, production and consumption and trade would have to go through if we want to live in a more sustainable way. At the UN General Assembly, some countries showed, quite a few actually, that they really know in which direction they want to go and they want to step up to the plate. Many said that they want to go carbon neutral, including with commitments by specific dates. Others indicated that they were moving forward with removal of tariffs on environmental goods and services. Now, beyond this dimension of the urgency on the environmental side, we also face challenges concerning value chains, how green they are, how much these value chains respect social and labor standards, how clean they are. And this is where we also have to move a bit faster. At ITC, working with many partners, many of whom will be in this room these 3 days, we're bringing solutions to small and medium enterprises in the area of climate adaptation, climate mitigation, resource efficiency, working with around 40% of the global fast fashion industry to drive convergence in responsible social and labor practices while reducing duplication of audits. We are putting Tier 1 and Tier 2 garment manufacturing facilities on a map to provide the transparency that is necessary. These are all positive steps, but this is not enough. This is why we decided to talk about there is no planet B as the theme for this forum. It's a bit of a cliche, if you wish, but we have to repeat this because there is no planet B. Second, we wanted to give a sense that we should, but also we can accelerate the move. This is why you will be hearing from experts, from panelists, from farmers, to experts in shipping, in clothing, in standards, in reduction of CO2 emissions, and the rest. But we will also be working with you with practical examples on how to move faster in this journey. We want this forum, we want to be able to walk the talk, so we want to make this forum also a bit more sustainable. Other than my papers for this short introduction, we will be paperless. Please use the app that has been created for this event. Coffee breaks will be with glassware and cups so that we also, again, show the way. The food we will be catering is lower in carbon footprint than in the past, and this is what we are trying to be the norm. We will be abating all the trouble from all the participants so that, again, we offset our carbon emissions. And to conclude, we will also be launching an ITC mainstreaming guide. Mainstreaming is a horrible word. Basically is a set of practical recommendations to integrate into policy making social, environmental, and gender dimensions of our work. So stay tuned. With this, I want to thank again Prime Minister Mia Mottley for being with us this morning, and of course, looking forward to listening to you. Also, telling you that next year we will be launching the first Trade for Sustainable Development hub in the Caribbean, hopefully in Barbados when we go there next. Thanks again.
I should have known that with Arantxa everything would be efficient, including my introduction. And I thank her for that. I was supposed to have been here 1 year ago, but there was a tropical storm called Kirk that literally prevented my moving from New York at the General Assembly and required my return home. I make appointments in September nervously because the new norm is the one to which the rest of you have now been exposed. Regrettably, for some 30 years, the Alliance of Small Island States have been trying to signal that something was upon us and that it would have devastating consequences. They got the Commonwealth Secretariat to develop a vulnerability index exactly 30 years ago, in 1989. But it became an almost academic exercise because while the world was prepared, in this city in particular, to hear about LDCs and to hear about HIPIC countries, for whatever reason, it could not allow itself to bridge the artificial construct that was created as to the validity of who was and who is a small island developing state. The conversation and debates have almost been farcical. And if there were those looking in from planet B, they would believe that they were farcical. But like with my arrival here today, time goes on and we do what we have to do. And I thank Arantxa and the International Trade Center for the opportunity to share just a few thoughts with you this morning, 1 year later, but nevertheless still relevant, perhaps even more urgent than it was 1 year ago. 1 year ago, we had not yet determined that at all costs, our advocacy now as a country must be to keep this on the front burner. The world kind of suspected that something went awfully wrong in 2017 in Dominica and Barbuda. When I spoke 2 weeks ago at the United Nations about the prevalence of climate refugees in the Caribbean, some people may even have thought that it was a form of exaggeration. But might I remind you that it didn't start with the hurricanes, and that Montserrat, with the volcano, perhaps produced the first set of climate refugees out of the Caribbean in the modern post-independent world. Regrettably, that has continued. And there is no better person or stronger voice than that of the United Nations Secretary General, who has perhaps more aptly described Dorian in a way that none of us can even come close to. It was category hell. For those of us who flew into the Bahamas within 48 hours of the all clear, it was absolutely patent that the destruction was unimaginable. And I want to put it in context for you because it sounds good listening to a speech, but understanding the process of the saga of Dorian perhaps better places it in context for us. Prior to Dorian hitting Grand Bahama and Abaco, the weekend before, its first port of call was to have been Barbados. And we awoke the Sunday morning, having known the Saturday night that there was potentially a storm out there, but we weren't sure of its movements. By 5 o'clock the Sunday morning, it was clear that this one, unlike most, because for those who don't appreciate the geography of the Caribbean, Barbados is actually the most easterly, and I had a geography teacher who would tell us we're in the Atlantic Ocean, and that's why if I find some wood to knock fast, but you would appreciate why he did that, because the last major hurricane that hit us was 1955. So that we are literally on the cusp. And once systems go south, there is a very good chance that it will hit us. Dorian went south. And to this day, other than the meteorologists saying it was dry air, virtually no rain and no high winds came to take us out. And we waited and waited for 36 hours, only to find out that the very Sahara dust of which we complain every year for decades was in fact the reason for our being missed or spared the full onslaught of Dorian as it then was. The same was not to happen in the Bahamas. And just as weirdly as Dorian behaved on the first weekend, it behaved equally as unpredictably and weird the second weekend, because what it then did was that it sat, and it sat, and it sat, and it sat, and it sat for over 30 hours 32, 33 hours, and delivered winds at that speed, having come over a very warm, almost hot Caribbean Sea. This is not fiction. Last Saturday, I was in Central Park with the Global Citizens Group, and at last we are beginning to see in the world that the voices of these nations for the last 30 years are not in isolation, and nor is it dependent only on a few right-thinking nations of the world who are prepared to accept the science as it is. Indeed, what is more frightening is that when you talk to the scientists, the early parts of the scientific research can be found in the 19th century and not in the 20th century with respect to what development fueled by carbon would do. It is only now being listened to. But as Arancha said, we can stay and reflect on the negative, or we can choose to seize our future and to shape it. We have no choice but to seize our future. And there are few things at each level, whether it is the international community, the nation state, or the individual, that have now to be the function and focus of all that we do. And because it is a destabilizing and a disrupting event, there will be opportunities, and not just gloom and doom. The question for us is, can we work to force the world to deal with this with a sense of urgency, such that we are not the collateral damage of an insensitive and procrastinating global community? The Climate Action Summit, as outlined at the United Nations 2 weeks ago, regrettably has still left the world divided. Those who believed in the wisdom of the science believe more fervently so, and are prepared to act quicker and with greater sense of urgency. We thank, in particular, Norway and Germany and other countries in Europe that have doubled down and recognized that their contributions to the Green Climate Fund, in order to be able to spark enterprise and research, are absolutely necessary. But equally, those countries that are prepared to find every excuse so as to delay the inevitable and so as to change how they do business, and are prepared to defer to another generation the conduct of new business, they regrettably have remained all the more intransigent as we go forward. What is required is for those of us who are absolutely certain that we have now to change how we do business, how we produce, how we eat, how we do all of the things that we are going to hopefully encourage our citizens to do, that we begin to recognize that that now has to meet the place where policy is created and policy is consolidated. And what do I mean by that? I entered public life just after the WTO was formed, and ironically I'm happy to see Mr. Lamy here, and more so because he has accepted to also help us reflect on the elusive growth for the Caribbean community that has not happened, regrettably, for the last 30 years. But decisions were made to create an order that would rid us of non-tariff barriers and other protective mechanisms because it made sense to open up. There's only one problem, as I said to Arancha when she was in Barbados, when they launched the coconut, phase 2 of the coconut project a few weeks ago, that the world retained the imbalance of power and structures with many of these new organizations, whether it is the United Nations, whether it is the WTO, whatever. And in retaining that imbalance and structure, it meant that small states who could never distort global trade in goods and services never had either access to the funding or, more importantly, the capacity to restructure their domestic production sectors, productive sectors, producing sectors, in order to be able to make use of this new framework for trading. Similarly, when we came to 9/11, the same thing happened again. The world recognized that it was in 1393. I still remember it. I was Attorney General at the time. And for the hell of me, would now apply to small states whose risk. And then we have it again with respect to climate change, where the risk once again now to us this time is patently greater than to any other region other than the Arctic and Antarctic summer sheets and Greenland. Coral islands are on the front line of this adjustment. But coral islands, like Bahamas, like Barbados, like Trinidad and Tobago, belong to institutions that may have development banks, but are told when funds are created that you can't access these funds because you're a middle-income country. Post-Dorian, we are waiting to see what will happen to the Bahamas. Because if they are like Barbados, who, when we became the government just over a year ago, within 1 week we determined that we had, as the third most indebted country in the world at the time, to restructure our debt and to go into an IMF program to bring normalcy and regularity back to the country as a matter of urgency. Now, when we did that we were told that we could not access development funds because we are a middle-income country according to the criteria of GDP per capita. Now, if, regrettably, the same fate that hit Barbuda, Dominica, Bahamas, hits my country tomorrow, I go from a discussion of quality education and curriculum reform and repositioning an educational system for a new development trajectory to the simple, bald issue of access to classrooms and schools. The almost 60,000 people that have had to be evacuated in the islands of the Bahamas have children among them. Where do they go to school? The people whose lives have been disrupted from their jobs are no longer earning. How do they earn to buy food? Where do they find shelter? I say all of these things because an island that is unprepared or a jurisdiction that is unprepared will always have greater damage than one that has built resilience and is ready for it. What was the evidence in the Bahamas? That those houses that were built on stilts because previous generations did not have the luxury of having a cell phone track a storm for you. Previous generations did not have the luxury of being able to get ready. They had simply to be ready all of the time. And in being ready all of the time, it meant that there was an innate resilience that previous generations had. And we say it in so many other things, but in this it was real. So that the manner in which we built was appropriate to be ready all of the time. We changed patterns in the 20th century, and aesthetics and keeping up with a level of Western imperialism and materialism became the order of the day, and everything was no longer driven by the functionality of previous generations. And we are paying the price for it now. So at the level of domestic states, we have to change, yet again, how we do things. But the problem is that in many instances we don't have the fiscal space. I just referred to the fact that Mr. Lamy is serving on a CARICOM Commission on Growth, because for 3 decades, the growth of the region has been underperforming significantly, and regrettably, on current trends with climate crisis, is likely to be one of the marginalized sectors and regions of the world, along with the Pacific, but in circumstances where it is not their presence alone that will be affected, but the neighborhood in which they live that will also be affected, and hence the short-sighted nature of those who refuse to work at multiple levels within the level of our citizenry, recognizing that the advent of the movement of young people being prepared to stand up for the world in which they will be living is by that young people are prepared to exercise the power of agency and the power of voice with respect to this climate crisis. It also means that they're likely to become compelling forces within the national governance structure of their individual territories. And hopefully, like with South Africa 30, 40 years ago, it was when battle against apartheid. We trust and pray from the small states of the world that this is what is happening. But we equally are cognizant that luckily a few forward-thinking multinational corporations and other financial institutions are beginning to appreciate that their norm is also changing, and that unless they get to the front of the line with respect to the new products and the new technologies, that they will be left out. Our country, Barbados, has set 2030 as the year by which we will have a fossil fuel-free country at best, or a carbon neutral at worst. And therefore, as we say in Barbados, one blow is kill old cow. And that is so. Limited growth of the last 3 decades, and given the limited fiscal and policy for concessional terms for developmental purposes that we face. As a result, what is needed now is the equivalent almost of a global Marshall Plan in order to build the resilience if we are to avert the migration that is likely to follow in the absence of no intervention with respect to climate. We can survive this. We can survive it 2 ways. At a very large and macro level at the globe, the world must not begin to believe that it is a victim of climate change, but the world must be prepared to make the decisions and to apply the resources necessary to halt and reverse climate change. I do not accept that it is beyond human ingenuity. I've said so over and over. But it is a subject of priorities. And in the same way that we prioritize spending in other areas, we can prioritize spending if it really mattered or if we believed it was urgent enough. At the same time, we need to recognize our victims of an international capital market that will render negative judgments on their credit rating such that they then are in a vicious cycle that they cannot get out of. So do we spend the money on retrofitting or building new roofs, building reefs to protect coastal economies, or do we spend the money on being able to complete the process in healthcare and education, have seen appreciable gains in the quality of life, only now for it to be paused because of the institutions like the International Trade Center, like the United Nations, will win the battle. Not because they're around for so many millions of people depends on this. And our ability to turn it around depends on data of debt to GDP, because we didn't start this battle. We just happened to be on the front for us to fight the battle because of its existential threats. I say that the voices that can be added to the world who are now, particularly the young people, embracing the fact that they will be around long in North America, in Asia, in Bangladesh of the differences. And then we talk about hurricanes, but the implications of climate crisis also impact on water that we take for granted. And for us, perhaps the worst of it, that are affected for regrettably now too many months of the year in the Caribbean crisis as the diabetes that attacks the organs of the body on a daily basis and produce how we eat, how we do so many things. And in those decisions to change it, to recognize that new products, the photovoltaic panels, then we need the renewable energy through wind. We then need to be able to find new products as we are now doing in the world. The question is, where will the production take place? One part of the Caribbean, we have a CARICOM single market that has not yet been the subject of, it has not passed you. So we are conscious that we live in a world where the framework or the common good. And to that extent, no tropical storm, because the boats, the ships that were due to come down to deliver food in the region could not use the normal channels because increase our presence and our voice in international trade matters is because we need food security to ensure that we have food during the months of the hurricane season. But then I lose money for the rest of the year because there is open season and there is literally markets that will flood our own market, because the message will control us that if we have the same problem and we keep doing the same thing over and over, that it is a definition of madness. Small states cannot continue arguing for vulnerability over and over and over for 3 decades and to be ignored, and for us to believe that therefore that the world cares enough about us. The bottom line is that the opportunities for trade and economic activity are there. What is missed start with 100%. Let us claim ground where we are, and let us ensure that those countries to be able to make the changes where we can in terms of renewable energy, in terms of banning coal plants, in terms of planting trees, in terms of our work with materials, not just plastics, but other materials that have the capacity to regrettably alter the world that we've come to love. And if we can do that together, then I trust and pray that if I'm ever given an opportunity to address this Sustainable Trade Forum again, that it will be from the perspective that we are seeing the benefits of new trade for a new norm for the people of the front line in this climate crisis. I thank you.
And caution, which I think set the tone for our forum. Thank you very much. I would also like to ask everybody to download the app, because when we take questions in some of the panels, then you can write on the app in the news feed. We'll also take questions the old-fashioned way too, by raising our hands. Some of you were also asking about the Wi-Fi. If you turn on the back of your badge, you'll see that there's details of the Wi-Fi. So that's some housekeeping notes for everybody. Please do seamlessly change the set without anybody noticing that this is happening. And for those who are standing at the back, there are some seats in the front, so please don't be scared. We always go back to school and sit at the back rather than in the front, so please do come down. Those seats are now free. We've heard that young people are the stakeholders for the future, and we're going to have a short discussion with a very impressive young woman I'm afraid when you get to my age, everybody is young. She'll most probably say that that's not the case. But I would very much like to present Olivier Saxe, who is the president of Climates, which is an organization that aims to empower the climate generation. Please come and sit, and you'll be given a microphone. We're playing a bit past the parcel with a microphone. Arantxa, would you be so good as also to join us? Excellent. Arantxa, the last forum was on SDG 12 about sustainable production and consumption, and we heard the Prime Minister there talking about how it's really important to change business, to change production and consumption. How are you wanting to build on that in this forum?
So essentially for us, this is the 6th edition of the Trade for Sustainable Development Forum. We started 6 years ago because we saw that multilateralism cannot just simply work with the states. It needs to have other forces around the table, and it's all these other forces that we wanted to bring to the table in this forum. 2, because we saw there was too much fragmentation, and there were solutions, but these solutions were too small scale, too fragmented, for things where we needed scale, and maybe we needed a bit of greater coordination. Which is the house of the trade community, whether in WTO, whether it's UNCTAD, whether it's the UN Economic Commission for Europe, whether it's the International Trade Center, but it's also the home to the environmental community. There is also a big environmental community here in Geneva, and the two were not talking to each other. So in a way, we wanted to build this as a collaborative effort to move the needle forward. Every year is a topic that unpacks how can we make international trade and international value chains more sustainable. Latest edition was production and consumption last year. This year with a bit more of an emphasis on climate change. What we do every year is what we learn, we put in practice the following year. So what we've been doing all during 2018 is put in place what we learned in the forum last year, including this mainstream guide that, as I said, we will be putting together. But what I'm interested to hear, I'm interested to talk a little bit less, if I may, and I'm interested to hear Olivia, because she is one of these dimensions of multilateralism which we had not really put under the tent and up until recently, which is the voice of the generation that would be impacted by whatever happens in the international community today.
Yeah. How are you doing that? Tell us a little bit about your organization, how big it is, where it operates, and some of the things that you've done.
So, as you said earlier, Climates is a youth organization that was created 80 years ago, and we gather approximately 300 volunteers all around the world, with some very strong local communities in France, in Madagascar, Mali, or Nepal. I'm forgetting some, but anyway, our point is to make young people work together in an interdisciplinary and international manner to address the challenges related to climate change, not only climate change in itself, but also all the environmental and social dimensions that are related to it. We have 3 different kinds of projects our volunteers can join. We have research projects where volunteers can learn how to do research and also how to raise awareness about the results of the research, because we are think and do tank. We also have awareness-raising projects in themselves, so where we just go to an external audience and try to bring the challenges of climate change and related issues. And the 3rd dimension is the advocacy part. And for us, it's very important that youth understands how decision-making happens. So for example, we send every year delegations to the COPs and the intersessions where the negotiations on climate happen. And this allows young people to understand how the decision-making process happens, how it's difficult, how it's slow, but also how they can influence or try to influence things. And also, well, maybe I'll come back to this later on.
Yeah, no, I was just interested by the climate change conferences, and having attended them, what is your finding? How can young people influence them? Because they're massive talking shops. I remember from my days at WWF, attending them, and they've got them bigger and bigger and bigger. So how do you actually monitor what's going on and try and make a difference?
It is difficult. Indeed, a lot is happening, and the language is very technical. So the first step is to make people understand what is actually happening. So usually we allocate one topic of negotiation to one or two persons that can follow it. And then we have this partnership with the French delegation. So we are able to meet delegates and understand their insights in the negotiations.
So they give you some insider tips
Absolutely.
That you can then pass on.
And that's very interesting for us. And then it's also interesting for them, as we can tell them about what the youth perspective is. And I think the most important part, or one of the most important parts of understanding how the negotiations work, is also not to rely only on these UN spheres, but also understand that the actions comes from multiple levels, taking action at the national level, doing advocacy, really taking all the citizen levers we have at our disposal, and at the individual level as well.
So we heard Arantxa was saying that the tone wasn't very optimistic at the UN Climate Action Summit. I mean, what's your reading out of that? Because there was mass youth movement. 6 million people, I think, were on those streets around the world in 150 countries. We had Greta Thunberg, telling the world to wake up and to panic. But then when we actually got to what came out of that summit, there was a lot of disappointment. What was your take on it as a young person?
Well, as you said, I'm a little bit disappointed that we didn't manage to have more commitments of big polluters. We hope that there will still be some in 2020, the crucial year for states to actually revise their NDCs, National Determined Contributions, and enhance their ambition. We'll see about this. We still hope there will be something happening. We were also pleased to see that there were some business commitments, and that's very important as well, although we could have more. And the positive thing is, of course, that a lot of people mobilized, and I think it's not over, and we will continue trying to mobilize as many people as possible, raising awareness, but also making them understand how they can put pressure on their governments and companies, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem that young people are incredibly good at raising awareness and very successful at that. But then, of course, there's raising awareness and action and changing behavior. What do you think needs to be done to keep the momentum going after that Climate Action Summit? What would you like to see?
Wait, so what? Sorry, it's a difficult question. Well, I think we need to continue the way we did it, but maybe also try to influence the political decisions more. And for now, young people, for example, went on the streets, but I think they can maybe try to understand better the decision-making processes and try to be included and influence somehow this. Difficult task, of course, but I think there is something to do there, creating more dialogue between people who do not understand each other. We all live in our bubble. I'm in this environmentalist bubble, you're in the trade and sustainability bubble, and I'm looking forward to our talks because it's important to understand each other and maybe bridging this gap. And internationally it's very important as well, between countries, within a country, to bridge the gaps and understand each other.
I mean, Arantxa, I was just thinking there because, of course, Greta Thunberg is saying don't panic, but she's also talking about the fairy tales of economic growth. So there is a gap there between the perception on trade, its value, and, I mean, do we need also to better sell trade or integrate the environmental aspects better into trade?
No, I don't think we need to sell better trade. I think what we have to do is do more good trade. And this is in a way, the term we have coined for ourselves and hopefully also for the international community, in which we just not say that trade is good and that trade can contribute to sustainability, which it can, but that we make it contribute to sustainability. So in reality is being honest about the conversation, being honest about what trade brings, but also being honest that the way in which trade happens, the way in which production happens before trade, the way in which trade happens, and the way in which consumers respond needs to be adapted and adjusted, because we need to be less intense in carbon emissions, and this has to be the norm. So it's not just greening trade or let's say greenwashing trade, but greening it, being honest. One of the things that came out of the Trade for Sustainable Development Forum last year was, for us, working with our funders and working with our partners, including very specifically Sweden, that has embarked with us in this journey, is open trade, what we call trade for sustainable development hubs in countries. These hubs will be places in countries. We've started with 6 countries, and we are basically rolling out the 6th edition now. It will be in Nepal soon, with more coming up next year. What we try to do is create spaces with knowledge, with experience, with methodologies that helps actors locally adjust to a less carbon-intensive production and trade. So in a way, trying to support the greening of the value chains. And listening to you, Olivia, and listening to the fact that Climate has a chapter in Nepal, it occurs to me that this is a very clear space where Climate and ITC could be working together, which is making sure that the spread of knowledge and good practices also happens through the integration of the youth in these hubs, which is a practical contribution to not just, again, not just talking about it, but just doing it.
So we're going to have, 2 days of talking practical exercises. I would like to say that Olivier will be joining a conversation at the end of today where you'll be able to ask her questions. Arantxa, of course, will be here throughout as a presence. I'm going to just thank you both, because we need to keep to time. That's the danger of giving me a microphone. I can say that we're going to move to our next panel, but please give a round of applause to 2 female leaders.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we've been talking about Planet B, that there is no